Hello and welcome to our first mini lecture on environmental policies. In this one, we're going to talk about public policy in general. In our next little mini lecture, we'll talk about fairness and perceived justice issues. So what we're talking about here is how do we get people to engage in community acceptance of green initiatives? That is, if we are making a change in a rule or legislation or a public policy, um, we have to at some point get buy-in from individuals and from communities. When we talk about acceptability, we are talking about some sort of social buy-in, some basing on fact, and some basing on the will of the people to make a change. But in general, when a policy gets made, people have to conform to that policy or face consequences for violating the policy. And societies in general experience positive or negative outcomes from implementation of a policy. So when we're looking at how policies get enacted, right, social policies take an issue and move it from an educational sort of standpoint into a civic sort of standpoint. And that goes from acceptance in the legal way all the way up to uh, public buy-in. Uh, so if we wanted to think about a sort of a visual framework of the various strategies we can use um, as we move our way through public and to the people who can make decisions, as well as moving people from knowledge to motivation to behavior, we can think about all sorts of different ways that public policy could be enacted. So when we think about environmental change in general, uh, we're focusing on multiple possible levels and targeting where we need to make a difference. Here's a graph that shows that idea of how individuals relate to the overall public policy and how we move through the various systems involved in understanding policy. So when we think about how public policy happens, um, at some level we have some aspect of different types of policies, right? Some policies are making rules, some policies are financial, some policies are uh, dealing with aid and giving out aid, some policies relate to security. So we're going to be dealing with, in general, for the most part, some distributive policies and some regulatory policies for environmental purposes. So acceptability could be a behavior, sort of like voting or signing stuff, doing something in support of a policy. Others could define uh, a policy in terms of an attitude, that we dislike or like a policy, we approve of it or disapprove of it. This leads to potential for a social dilemma, which relates to what we talked about in a previous lecture, the idea that we have positive outcomes on the collective level, but it involves personal sacrifices on the individual level. So how do we balance out the need for the good of the group and the need for the good of the individual? And so this comes back to the GEF hypothesis, the greed, efficiency, fairness uh, hypothesis from Wilkie, where we're trying to balance uh, the personal selfishness sort of elements of things, right? The personal benefits of wanting to do something a certain way, the collective benefits, how do we benefit as a group by doing this together, and the perceived fairness of how we implement things. So we'll talk about the first two in this lecture and the third one in the next little mini lecture. So by individual policy outcomes, personal benefits, what we're talking about is that in order to accept it, I need to either personally benefit from it or not have it cost me anything, right? It needs to be either free or beneficial. So in terms of targets, we're looking at targeting efficiency behaviors, energy efficient solutions, trying to increase environmental good. or curtailment behaviors. That is, we're trying to reduce environmental harm. So we either try to help people do the good things or stop doing the bad things. When we think about how we go about doing that, we can either engage in push measures or pull measures. Pull measures are incentives, rewards for engaging in environmental behaviors. Push, on the other hand, are punishments, disincentives for environmentally harmful behaviors. What I find as a psychologist is interesting is that the push measures tend to be um, more effective than the pull measures. But when we ask people if you think that pull measures are more effective or push measures are more effective, um, they say that pull measures are more effective, right? So people think that incentives work better than punishments. But when we actually look at people's behaviors, punishments tend to change behaviors more. Uh, so people maybe prefer pull to push personally, but in terms of actually changing their behavior, the punishments tend to take more, um, change behavior more quickly and more permanently than incentives do. The second piece to the GED is the E part, the efficiency part, the collective policy outcomes, that the desired use, effective use of those collective resources. How much money or land can the community save by recycling instead of putting stuff in the landfill? We have to decide, are those policies effective or will they be effective? Presumably, people should be getting some personal benefits from collective gains or collective improvements, but people will be more accepting if they are made aware of the issue, made concerned about the issue, and then we can see more acceptance later, what psychologists refer to as the sleeper effect, when maybe there's an initial upfront cost, but the benefits are realized or experienced later. And so when the benefits get experienced, maybe that's when the actual acceptance part on the individual level comes.